All right, joining me for this special episode of the channel is the ninth Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Navy fighter pilot and leader, a guy I've known for 44 years. That's kind of scary. Admiral Sandy Jaws Winnefeld. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
That's really a pleasure to be with you, Ward. Congratulations on the success of this show you've got. And it's a thrill to be with you, especially in my flight jacket. You know, didn't get to wear this very recently. So
it's like we coordinated here or something. So let's start from the beginning in terms of your influences. The Winnefeld family goes way back to your great grandfather. Tell us about that.
It does. My great grandfather was a Prussian cavalryman. I've got great pictures. I've got his sword. I've got his epaulets, his spurs. He emigrated to the United States in 1896 and became, of all things, a horticulturist, ran a nursery in New Jersey. And his son, my grandfather, was kind of a wild child, but was an enlisted machinist mate in World War II aboard a submarine tender in Perth, Australia, tough duty. And then, of course, his son, my father, went to the Naval Academy, which he considered to be his surrogate parents because his parents were kind of wild kids, and the rest is history. And of course, my son is a Naval Academy graduate and is currently a Marine artillery officer.
So I would see your parents around the yard when I was teaching there during my last tour on active duty from 98 to 02. And that's how I kept up with what you were doing. Now, you didn't go to the Naval Academy deliberately. You went to Georgia Tech. So what went into that decision?
Well, I was a little bit of a wild child myself, and I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to be in the Navy. It was intriguing to me, but I wasn't quite sure. And I really didn't want to take a spot at the Naval Academy away from a kid who wanted that more than anything in the world. I figured if I went to Georgia Tech, ROTC, it would be easier if I didn't like it to drop out of the ROTC program at a civilian school than to leave the Naval Academy, which I would have considered to be a personal disaster. So, and I also didn't want to follow too closely into my father's footsteps. There was a little bit of an independent streak there. In the long run, I couldn't have gone wrong either way. I love both institutions with all my heart to this day. Have served on the advisory boards for both institutions. And so it was one of those life's choices that just worked out.
As I mentioned, I met you 44 years ago at the Naval Academy. I was a plebe during plebe summer, and you were TAD on your way to flight school as a sailing instructor, Ensign Winnefeld. I will never forget it, that I had an ensign who wasn't yelling at me and kind of a cool guy and on his way to flight school. So, you were one of my earliest influences besides my dad in terms of choosing naval aviation. So let's talk about, you were done with your TAD. You went down to Pensacola. How did that go? Obviously, you wound up going jets. So let's talk about your early aviation into your journey to the Tomcat community.
Well, I grew up all over the country since my dad was in the Navy, but spent some of my formative years in Coronado at North Island. So I got to see these propeller airplanes flying around, smelling 115, 145 avgas, and sort of caught the romance of naval aviation from a front row seat. From at the cradle of naval aviation right there at North Island. So showing up in Pensacola, Florida was like a dream come true. It was one of those spine tingling things for me. It's like, wow, I'm finally here. And then of course you plunge into it and find out that, naval aviation is a hot, tired and dirty business and you got to work your tail off if you're going to do well. And I kind of plunged into that. I felt fortunate to be selected for jets. My father, got his wings the wrong week and ended up flying TBM Avengers instead of jets. But I felt very fortunate and then headed off down to Kingsville, Texas, right in the midst of the Iranian Revolution to start a year of finishing out flight training down there. But what a great experience going through flight school.
So a lot of my viewers want to know how flight school went. Did you have any problem areas? Did you have a natural aptitude for the airborne environment? How did that?
No, I've always believed that your ability comes from sort of three things: your natural ability, your personal motivation to work hard, and then the kind of teachers you have. And I was blessed with 2 of the 3. I had really good teachers at flight school and I worked hard, but I didn't feel like I carried any particular natural ability in there. But you find that the 2 can make up for the 1 fairly well. And everybody going through flight school has hiccups. I had great flights. I had flights where I almost got a down. I never got a down, but I almost got one in primary flight school. And because one of my last flights in the T-28, I'm doing really, really well and all that. And all of a sudden, my flight instructor in the back seat says, "So Sandy, ever been to New Orleans?" And I said, I'm thinking, oh man, everything's going really well. He's chatting with me. And I said, "Well, no, sir, I haven't." He goes, "Well, if we're going to get there if we keep heading this direction instead of going to Pensacola to land." It's like, oh no, I'm in such trouble. But I survived that. I also almost got a down on my last flight at Kingsville in the advanced jet community for lowering my landing gear, or trying to lower my landing gear a little bit above gear speed. So, you have to understand that you can make mistakes and you can get through them as long as, fundamentally you're working hard and doing the best you can.
So you CQ'd on Lexington?
Actually, no. Lexington was in the shipyard. So my first CQ in the T2 was down on USS Nimitz, I think it was, off of Key West. So I actually I landed in the backseat of a T2 once on Lexington, so I can claim to have seen that little tiny ship from the back of an airplane. But all my CQ was in fleet carriers. And I'll never forget being down there in Kingsville. And because we were off the coast of Cuba, we had to have literally an F-14 combat air patrol above us. And seeing these really cool Tomcat guys in the elevator at the BOQ at NAS Key West was like, oh, these guys are gods. I can't be these guys. These are like flying actual F-14s. Well, turns out they put on their shoes the same way we all do. But it was kind of a cool thing to be CQing underneath a cap of F-14s.
Absolutely. So you get Tomcats, you went West Coast, right? So you went to 124 for the RAG.
Very fortunate. There were 2 of us, Lieutenant J.G. Whiskey Bond, wonderful, wonderful human being. He and I were the first guys to get jets directly out of flight training in a long time. Most of the people going to F-14s were plowback instructors, surgrads. We were the first 2 in a long time to actually go directly there. So we felt good and showed up in San Diego, California at VF-124, ready to jump in the big airplane.
So go through the RAG, CQ in the RAG. Do you remember what boat that was?
Yeah, I CQ'd on Nimitz on the East Coast in weather that was, and seas that were out of limits for a CQ, but everything's waverable, right? So I had never flown with a poopy suit on before. I had never experienced the kind of pitching deck in my previous CQ evolutions. And it was, it's hard enough trying to land an airplane on an aircraft carrier at night for the first time. But when you're stuck in that hot, sticky poopy suit and the deck is pitching, it was very difficult CQ evolution. I swear I can remember seeing the propellers come out of the water in the daytime on one of my landings.
Yeah, I tell that story of the North Atlantic with Grinch Brophy, where he saw the screws come out, and we had a long bolter as a result of that. So I can relate to that image. Yeah. So get done with the RAG. What was your Nugget tour? Which squadron?
Went to VF-24 and the Fighting Renegades out there in San Diego, and spent 2.5 years in that squadron. It was a great tour. Had some wonderful shipmates, as we all have had in our many squadron tours.
Get done with that tour. Now it's time to look at short tour options.
I was very lucky to go through Top Gun as a student with Dave Baranek, bio, in my backseat, because he's a fantastic Rio. And I was very lucky to go through with Boomer Stufflebeam and Steve Jacobsmeyer on my wing. So we had a very good section, very mature people, and we did fairly well in the class. There's no such thing as a Top Gun trophy, but who knows? Maybe we would have won it. I don't know. Bottom line is we got through. And so I think we did well enough that we were both brought back as instructors. There are a lot of options in there. You can try to go to test pilot school. You can try to go rush the blues. You can do whatever. But this is really what I wanted to do. I was very fortunate to, as a nugget, to fly for a very long time on the wing of Marty Chanik, Streak Chanik, who was a former Top Gun instructor and just a magnificently talented teacher and flight lead. And so that kind of put the fire in my belly to go try to reach the pinnacle of the fighter business by going and being an instructor there. I was very fortunate.
You mentioned Boomer. Boomer was CAG when I was CAG Ops years later. Again, we're demonstrating how small the Tomcat community is. And then Streak, I did an episode about Constant Peg, and Streak was one of the pilots there, along with Dollar, at Constant Peg, flying MiGs during the important years of that program.
So to show you how small the world really is, I ended up relieving Streak, and I know we'll get to this later, as the CEO of Enterprise. And I ended up relieving Boomer as the commander of 6th Fleet. So it was really a joy to be able to relieve old friends and fellow Tomcat buddies in some jobs further down the line.
While you were at Top Gun, so I hadn't seen you since you were a stash ensign at the Naval Academy, and then I was in VF-32, summer of '85, just off our first cruise, my first deployment on Independence. We're doing what's called the Fleet Fighter Air Readiness Program, FARP, and you guys had your road show out to Oceania, and so I reconnected with you, met Bio, met Hollywood Dishart. This is kind of the, all-star team of that era. And I remember we were having this conversation, and you said, "Oh yeah, they're filming this movie. It's called Top Gun." And the director's, kind of he's nibbling at getting things wrong, and we're making sure he gets it right. And I think it was Hollywood said, "Yeah, there was this one scene where they're briefing in the hangar, and this guy's wearing a cowboy hat." And I went to Tony Scott and I said, "There's no way they'd be wearing a cowboy hat, so they're going to take that out." Obviously, they didn't. But talk to us about what that was like, because you were very much involved with the filming of Top Gun while you were there.
Yeah, so it was interesting. They came to us with the script first, and Bob Willard, Rat Willard, was sort of the liaison with them. And we were trying to decide, this script is kind of scary. It's not very good. We have a choice. We can run away, or we can and help them fix it. And Bob did a remarkable job, along with a couple of other folks, kind of tidying the script up. And you see some lines that have crept into the movie, like, time to do some pilot shit, or, I hate it when that happens. Those were things we were saying all the time that somehow made their way into the script. And then, the flying was not that exciting. It's hard to capture the violence of air combat on film. But what was more fascinating for us is watching how these people made movies on the ground. And to your exact point, watching them film a scene that's ostensibly in a classroom, that's actually in a hangar bay with an A4 in the background. We're sitting there going, these people are idiots. This is never going to work. And then you see on the screen that it's brilliant. They really do know how to do this. And, maybe we amateurs don't necessarily understand other people's business. But it was interesting to see the expense and the trouble they would take to get just a 10-second shot on the ground for that movie. They would bend over backwards. Money was not an issue.
So did you have any interface with any of the main actors while they were out there?
Obviously, we would bump into them frequently. The biggest interface I had is a couple of us went with Tom Cruise and Tony Scott to a bar in San Diego, because they were researching us. They wanted to know who these people were. They'd want to know what's it like to take a cat shot. And I have to admit, I had no idea at the time who Tom Cruise was. He had been in risky business. He was this guy with a ponytail. And it's like, you're going to play me? I don't think so. But they were both great guys. Particularly Tony Scott was just a really good person, as was Tom. And it was interesting to see them do their research on us, trying to figure out who we were.
We can judge the details and the hokiness of it, but it lives in the American pop consciousness. We're all looking forward to the sequel here coming out around Memorial Day. So I think, to your point, whatever Tony Scott did in terms of settings and pacing and so forth, he's the expert, and the results speak for themselves. The other thing to focus on, actually, Top Gun and the mission of Top Gun. I remember how you guys were so exacting in debriefs during FARP. So we had dealt with VF-43, and there were some greats attached to VF-43 during those years, including our dear late friend Snort Snodgrass and other icons of the East Coast community. Because the other thing we should mention is that there was really sort of an insulated East Coast, West Coast Tomcat thing.
Mhm.
And to this day, people go, "Did you know
Yeah.
Screamer Jones?" I'm like, "Where was he?" He's like, "Oh, he was in VF 111, same time as you." I'm like, "I'm sorry, but we didn't ever really see each other."
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you'd have somebody like you guys from Top Gun, or God forbid, somebody would migrate from the other coast to be a RAG instructor or just show up as department head, they were kind of an anomaly,
Yeah.
and as people generally stayed East Coast and West Coast, the cultures were different in subjective ways. But I just remember how exacting you were and how demanding you were of both pilot and Rio. And this is where bio was very influential to me. Like, let me see your kneeboard card and your spaghetti from that engagement,
Yeah.
and so that really made me take a round turn on my performance.
So a couple of thoughts on that. One of the great benefits of Top Gun was that we brought ex West Coasters and ex East Coasters together in the same sort of cauldron, of quality. And I learned a lot from people from both coasts, grew to love them as friends. But you're right, there were some cultural differences, but I think it was really important to have that place where both coasts came together in one squadron. So that's one. And then the other thing I would tell you, there are two sort of experiences I had during my career that fundamentally changed me as a person. One of them was nuclear power school, and the other one was serving as an instructor at Top Gun. Because even though we had a lot of fun and a lot of camaraderie, the standards were set incredibly high from the moment you walked into that squadron. And I know there are other places on the planet, the Blue Angels the same way, et cetera. But this is what my experience entailed. And just being able to perfectly recreate what occurred in 3 different 1-versus-1 engagements on a single sortie, and to debrief it in a very tactful way. Instead of saying, "So what were you thinking here?" It was more like, "What was the F-14 thinking when it went into the vertical?" All those exacting things, all the way down to really trying to precisely be able to tell the other guy on the other airplane what his airspeed and what his G was in the middle of a fight, much less your own. It was quite an experience, and I'm really grateful to the mentors that I had at Top Gun, the older instructors when I first got there, who really breathed that into us. It was quite an experience.
The first time I ever heard the term murder board was in relation to Top Gun. And so each one of you had an area in which you were a subject matter expertise, either a weapon, like somebody was a Phoenix missile, or a part of the mission set, a tactic. And you had to know that brief cold, and you'd have to brief your colleagues, and they would, really push back and make you get it right. Things about specifics, how to draw the spaghetti, how to draw an arrowhead on a whiteboard, how to sanitize, no rings, no watches, no e-dunk, right? All of these, it's like a Fortune 500 company that really takes a strain on the brand. But for you guys, it was, it's not about us. It's no ego, unlike the movie, no ego. And I think that really just, you guys exuded that.
If you wanted to give an hour-and-a-half lecture as a Top Gun instructor, you had to go through a murder board, and I think we coined that term. And the debrief for the murder board would last usually around 6 or 7 hours, where every single instructor in the room, and every instructor had to be there for the murder board. You weren't allowed to miss those. Flight schedule shut down, everything, would make these exacting notes, and you would sit there and take it. And you might not pass. You might have to redo it if it wasn't good enough. So it was quite a process. And you were understandably, and I think this is an important thing, is you're expected to know 10 times the amount of information that you actually present in the brief.
So you leave Top Gun, then what? Department head tour?
Department head tour at VF1, the Wolfpack.
Okay, Wolfpack, Roger.
Yep. Had the opportunity to jump out of an F-14 700 miles west of San Diego in that tour, which was no fun.
Okay, so talk about that. What was that?
Well, it was a basic intercept hop. Basically, we do these things to maintain night proficiency more than anything else, right? And I had perceived, it was dusk, depth perception incredibly difficult at this time of dusk at night, and I had perceived that one of the airplanes. This was before we had altitude blocks. And one of the other airplanes was on a collision course with me, I still believe. And so I did an very violent evasive maneuver up and left. I'll never forget it. And of course, both engines stalled and flamed out, and we ended up in a spin and had John Wood actually was my Rio Woody, who later got his wings as a pilot, punched us out at 10,000 feet. And we got picked up about 45 minutes later.
So you were in a full up flat spin?
Full up nighttime flat spin.
Ooh, nighttime.
God love it. It's hard enough in the daytime.
Yeah.
And, stick was rock solid. The hydraulics were gone because the engines flamed out. Those wonderful TF-30s.
So whether the AMB press on,
Yep.
and so you finished that tour in VF1. What did you do while you waited to screen?
Actually, it was very interesting. This is a career point, I think, for people. And I'm, this is tabula rasa, right? Or at least total transparency. I actually got a number 2 department head fit rep in VF1. And my squadron CO brought me in and debriefed me on it and said, look, you've done a great job. I think you can screen with a number 2 fit rep because of your background as a Top Gun instructor and all that kind of stuff. This other guy, your competition, was in Japan for his first tour. Nobody knows who he is. He's a great officer. I want to see him screen too. So I'm giving him the number 1. And you can imagine how crushed I was. Oh my God, why did I take the bonus? I should be flying in the airlines, woe is me. Turned out he was right. I did manage to screen. And I think one of the things that helped me was that I accepted orders to the Joint Staff in Washington, D.C. And this was in the wake of Goldwater Nichols. And everybody went, you're going to what? If you want to screen, you got to stay in the cockpit, dude. You got to go to the RAG and continue to burnish your reputation and stay in the community. I said, no, I think I probably ought to do this, and ended up sort of as operational as you can be inside the Beltway in the Joint Operations Directorate on the Joint Staff, and was kind of like the guy when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So we were on the skyline as a little 3-person mini directorate, writing all the deployment orders and supporting General Powell and all that kind of stuff during that very busy time when Iraq invaded Kuwait.
The conventional wisdom was stay in the cockpit at all costs. I mean, you're on the forefront of this change in what was, let me say, mandatory in terms of checks in the block to screen, including jointness, advanced education, all these sorts of things. But to your point, back when I was a Cat 2, it was like, do not leave the cockpit. Why would you go to the Pentagon for all, of all places? Yeah. So obviously you approached it with a mature outlook and you made the most of it. But what was that like in terms of work tempo and essay and all the kinds of things that you took away from that?
Yeah, it was interesting because I got there, and I got there in January of, I want to say 1990. And for the first 6 months, I was learning the job, reading everything I possibly could about the Middle East, because that was our sort of area of operations, and watching Saddam Hussein rattle his saber to invade Kuwait. At the same time, the Soviet Union was collapsing. So our entire intelligence canon was focused on the Soviet Union and not so much on Iraq. And we were in there going, hey, this is about to happen, guys. And we were being told, no, Iraq is our friend. They helped us during the Iran-Iraq war and the tanker wars and all that. We're not going to do any planning for Iraq. Well, next thing you know, they've invaded in August of 1990. And for, the good 8 months after that, I was on shift work, essentially working, 16-hour days in the Pentagon on the crisis action team. So very, very busy. Ended up getting noticed by General Powell when he needed an aide on very short notice, a senior aide, because he had to fire an Army guy that was working for him. He tapped me to come down to the front office, and I got to be his aide for 1 year. They wanted me for 2, but I didn't know any better. I said, I'm sorry, I can only do it for 1. And they went, okay, I guess that's all right. And so it was a fascinating experience learning the sort of Joint Staff Operations Directorate processes for 1.5 years or so. And then being an aide to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for 1 year, learning from General Powell himself, who was a remarkable man. And also that sort of layer of leadership was a priceless 2.5 years for me.
So that on your record as you're in the tank trying to screen for command obviously eclipses a number 2 look as a department head for sure. So that was very much a get well tour. And so you screened, you wound up being the XOCO of 211.
But Ward, I'll take it even further. It was remarkable because I actually made commander 1 year early, which blew me away, totally shocked me. I never would have expected that in the best of times. much less with a number 2 fit rep. And I think the Navy was not saying something about me personally. They were saying something about the importance of jointness. We're going to take this guy who's gone to a joint tour and we're going to promote him early as a signal to the rest of you. So my ego did not swell because of that, I can assure you. But that was what was so remarkable about that whole thing. And then when it came time to going to a fighter squadron, this is when the F-14D was new to the fleet, brand new. And all the people who screened that year were like desperate to go to the F-14D. And I was a little worried that, it's a new airplane. Yeah, it's cool. It's sexy. It's got a great radar, big engines, but, it's not a plane yet. It's not deploying. And I want to deploy. I want to go overseas. I want to lead a fighter squadron on an aircraft carrier. And so I said, just send me wherever you want to send me. I don't care. And they sent me to VF-211, which had F-14Bs at the time, but was transitioning back to F-14As. The oldest F-14As in the fleet were going to VF-211. We were joking, okay, we're going to go to F-8s next, because that's where we came from. But it ended up, hey, wouldn't you rather deploy as a squadron CO than fly a sexy new airplane? Hell yeah.
Well, plus the D didn't have any air-to-ground capability. It was, for all of its Gucci APG 71 and IRST, it was lagging in terms of the lethality that the A and the B were assuming. So did you do any Lantern stuff?
And at the time, it only had a pulse radar too. They didn't have the pulse Doppler radar up yet. So it was really, yeah. Right. So air to ground, one of the things that I really believed in was that with the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, that the air-to-air mission of the F-14 was going to be much less important than before, and that if we were going to survive as a community, we had to start taking on the air-to-ground mission as well. We had to become strike fighters, not just fighters. And as you know, Ward, that wasn't a very popular idea with some of the old guys. Hey, we ain't no mud bouncers. We ain't no air-to-ground guys, and that sort of thing. But we really took the completely opposite approach. And there were squadrons on the East Coast, and we were on the West Coast, kind of pushing for this. We weren't the only game in town. But we pushed extremely hard, and we won the bomb derby at Miramar for the first 3 years they ever held it, because we were just so far ahead. And we did a couple of things. One thing, when the A6 community was going away at the time, it was like, I don't want no stinking A6 guys. And I said, no, I want the very best A6 guy I can find, because this guy's going to be a genius compared to the rest of us on air to ground. And we did that. And he really, really enhanced our capabilities as an air-to-ground squadron.
What years was that XOCO? What years were you there with 211?
I was there 1993 to 1995.
So and I had years.
Yeah, and I deployed as an XO. We came back, and I had an abbreviated tour as a CO because they needed somebody to go to nuclear power school on very short notice. So I spent probably a year as CO when most people were spending, a year and a half or 18 months, 2 years, something like that. And so it was hard to leave, but we were in the middle of a beginning of workups. I wasn't going to deploy anyway. We did have an interesting situation there. There was the last 3 months of the fiscal year in 1994, they took all our money away. We had to put all except 3 of our airplanes in bags. We got like hardly any flight hours at all. And I was told, Winnefeld, show the pain. And I just sort of said to myself that, that's not my job, is to show pain. My job is to create the best fighter squadron I can with the money that the taxpayers give me. And we kind of rallied the squadron around that. And we did all kinds of cool things, went up to Nellis, looked at the museum, flew the living daylights out of the simulator, gave people leave, did a lot of ground training. And our goal was to emerge even better when we were done than when we went into that low funding period. And I think
what do they mean by show the pain? Like show that it's hurting your.
Show us how much that sucks. Yeah, show us how it hurts your pain, and how terrible your morale is, and all that kind of stuff. I said, you want me to show you how I'm gonna create a squadron with sky high morale in spite of this. Don't give me that. And
who was giving you that guidance? Fighter wing or
it was ICOM? Pretty senior people.
Okay, pretty senior people. Okay. Got it.
Pretty senior people. And we just said, we're not gonna make ourselves miserable. Humans are very good at making themselves miserable, and that's not going to be us. We're not going to be those guys.
You obviously screened for major command. You now are going nuke power pipeline. We talked to our good friend Slapshot at length about some of those things. You wound up being the CEO of Enterprise, which is a very unique carrier among nuclear-powered aircraft carriers.
I think they maybe picked me for Enterprise because it was almost 40 years old and was getting ready to go through what they call an in-serve inspection, which is a horribly difficult inspection for a ship. And I had in my deep draft an LPD, an amphibious transport, named USS Cleveland, that was very old and had successfully done an in-serve. So they go, well, maybe this guy could somehow get Enterprise through its in-serve, and we did. And because some interesting stories come out of that. And then, of course, took command from Marty Chanik, one of my heroes. And then we deployed. We had a sort of an amazing deployment where the first half was what you might call a love boat cruise, 6 different ports in the Mediterranean, just a wonderful time for the crew. And then the second half, we went through the Suez into the Gulf and did a lot of Operation Southern Watch work. When we went through the Suez that summer, there was a lot of 2001. There was a lot of noise on the net. Something big's about to happen. And we thought it might be us. So we were very, very careful going through the Suez, more than I'd ever seen before. We were armed to the teeth going through there. Nothing happened. We do our missions over Southern Watch, did a remarkable mission last night. We were in the Gulf led by a department head back then named Sam Paparo, who was currently, I think, commander of the
Pacific Fleet. Just saw him last week in San Diego. Yeah.
A wonderful officer. Think the world of him. So it's good to see the young guys growing up. And then we left the Gulf. We had a change of command for our strike group commander. Now we're on our way home, buzzing south off the coast of Oman. And it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my time, and 9 o'clock in the morning, East Coast time, when I get a call from my safety officer saying, Captain, you need to turn the TV on. And turn the TV on. And I get there at about the moment when the first tower's burning. There's a lot of confusion on the networks. Hey, was this just a little light plane that hit the tower? Is it an accident, or was it a terrorist act, or whatever? And right then and there, I saw the second plane hit the second tower. We're not going anywhere. And so there's a lot of folklore that goes on regarding what happened next. The folklore is that I threw my white scarf over my shoulder and said, let's turn Enterprise to the north. We're going to go get those guys, without any orders. That's just not the way these things happen. We slowed down. We had a discussion about whether we were going to fly that night or not for proficiency flying, which had previously been scheduled. We talked to Fifth Fleet, eventually got guidance to go back to the Gulf, and then we got additional guidance to go north to get to Afghanistan. And the thing I'm probably most proud of during that time is that we had to get a pretty decent distance overnight on that ship. And Enterprise is a pretty fast ship, but we had this problem that we had buttoned all our airplanes up, for a long transit to South Africa, and we needed to move a whole lot of elevators to get these airplanes back into fighting conditions so we'd be ready the next day. And you can't run elevators any faster than 20 knots. It's very dangerous to do that. But we needed to go 25 knots to get to our station. So, the navigator's telling me got to go 25. The, aircraft guys are telling me we can only go 20. And it's one of those weird things where, the guy in the middle kind of comes up with the answer. It's like, okay, we're going to go as fast as Enterprise can go. And then we're going to load up all 4 elevators when we're all ready, we'll slow down to 20 knots. We'll move them down and then do what we have to do, move them back up, and then we'll accelerate back up to as fast as Enterprise could go. And we'll at least average 25 knots over the course of the night. Simple sounding in hindsight, but it was 2 different people coming out of 2 different stovepipes who had their own needs. And we were there the next morning, ready to fight.
The initial strikes came off of your flight deck on October 7th, I want to say.
Well, we were part of the initial strikes. There was a lot of, there were Air Force strikes that went in early on. There were Tomahawk missiles that went in early on. And we were part of that first night because we were designated the night carrier because we were the most proficient carrier there. We had been out for an entire deployment, whereas Carl Vinson, who came in to relieve us, was on the first month of their deployment. So they anointed us as the night guys. So we were out there that first night with no Air Force tanking either. So we had to get as close as we possibly could to the Pakistani coast using our S-3 tankers organically to get the guys in and out of Afghanistan. And Captain Dave Mercer, who was our CAG at the time, just did a terrific job.
So you turn over command of Enterprise, and then where did you go?
After Enterprise, I had been on sea duty the entire time I was a Navy captain. It's brilliant. It's wonderful. You don't ever have to go to the Pentagon. It's just, your whole, it's away from home a lot, to be sure. You miss your family, but man, there's nothing like being at sea as a captain. Now I go to the Pentagon, and I am going to be the executive assistant to the vice chief of naval operations, who was Fox Fallon at the time. And I was a little nervous about that because I had never served on the Navy staff before. I had served on the Joint Staff, but I knew nothing about the Navy staff. And I'm going to be the executive assistant to the vice chief. But I was very fortunate in having a guy named Dave Roddy, Naval Academy graduate intelligence officer, working as my deputy. And he's the guy who sort of kept me out of trouble that whole tour. Very interesting working for Fox Fallon.
Then you are selected for flag rank.
Right.
And what was your first tour as a 1-star?
So Fox left being the VCNO and went down to be the head of Fleet Forces Command. And we have something called the Tonto School of Leadership, where you find a good horse and ride it until it drops. and I was the horse. So he sent me down to Fleet Forces Command to run the N8 down there. And that was, for a couple of years, an unremarkable tour, frankly, because it was an underpowered directorate. It was being asked to do much more than it could possibly do. But, got through that and ended up as the Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Striker Commander.
So how did that go? Any action, any highlights from that tour?
Yeah, I would tell you that tour in my career is the one where I had the most creative license, which is kind of what I live for. We did some really fun and amazing and creative things during that tour. One of which was to dramatically enhance our understanding of the ocean surface around us, because that's not something the surface warfare community is more focused on, being database managers and Spy 1 radar operators and anti-air guys. And that ability to understand what goes around you on the surface had atrophied horribly. So we fixed that. We did some really remarkable work there. Another thing we did, which is a really fun story, if it weren't, kind of part of a tragic story, is that this was in 2005 and 2006, when our troopers on the ground were probably at the most difficult time. We were losing a lot of people. It was at the time of the first Iraqi elections, the approval of the Iraqi constitution, and we were there providing support for our troopers on the ground. But every 3 weeks or so, we would go down to Dubai for needed maintenance, but we would all be down in the sandbox on the pier drinking beer. And I felt bad about that. I felt like, hey, we got troopers on the ground who are bleeding up there, and I'm down here drinking a beer in Dubai. I don't like that. So what can we do to have more continuity of support? Well, what do you think about putting a det of Hornets ashore in Al Asad Air Base in Iraq while we're down there in Dubai? So I flew into Al Asad in a Tomcat, because I was flying over Iraq on combat missions as the strike group commander. Talk about that in a minute. And hooked up with a guy named Boomer Milstead, who was then a Marine 1-star who was running the Marine operation at Al Asad. And we put together this plan where we would put 4 Hornets ashore. So that was a lot of work, because you got to train your people to operate ashore. They got to have a parts kit, that sort of thing. But we did it. And just before we were about to send the det ashore, we each got a message. I got a message from the Navy chain of command, not 5th Fleet at the time, who was Pat Walsh. He was very supportive, but further up, it said, "What the hell are you doing? What does it say about the relevance of naval aviation if all you have to do is put airplanes ashore?" And Boomer, the Marine Corps guy, gets the same message going, "What does it say about the relevance of Marine Corps aviation when all you have to do is put Navy guys ashore? Don't ever do this again. You can do it this time, but don't ever do it again." Okay, so we did it. It was hugely successful. We killed a bunch of guys who were laying IEDs to try to hurt our troops, and then it was done. So now it's time to leave the Gulf and go home. And now we have a problem, because there's USS Ronald Reagan is coming in from Pac Fleet to relieve us. Fox Fallon, who is now out at Pac Fleet, says, "Nope, I want to keep Reagan for 2 weeks so that we can do an exercise with the Indians, Malabar." UCOM commander is saying, "I've got to have my carrier presence. You can't delay Theodore Roosevelt leaving." And of course, Central Command's going, "Hey, we got a deal here. You got to support guys on the ground." So the elephants are all gnawing at each other. And I kind of said, I have a solution here. We could actually put a det of Hornets ashore in Al Asad and solve this whole problem. And so this time we put 6 Hornets ashore, and we left on time. UCOM got their presents. PACOM got their exercise, CENTCOM got their sorties, and everybody was happy. And we recovered our Hornets in the Mediterranean. So it was one of those, interesting turnarounds. But it did convince me that I still believe to this day that at least one Hornet squadron on every deploying aircraft carrier should be trained and configured and ready to debt ashore if needed. It's a huge force multiplier for this wonderful thing we call a carrier and an air wing.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the pushback that you got, because that's exactly what our good friend Seamus Flatley said when he was on his episode talking about the debt that he took ashore off of Kitty Hawk to support Task Force 20. They were like, what does this say about carrier aviation that we have to take airplanes off of the aircraft carrier? Which my thought is, it says that carrier aviation is super
great,
flexible, right? I mean, how agile is this?
Yeah.
Right? So it's just
so I also Ward, I got criticized briefly about 6 months after I got back from the deployment. There's an article in Tailhook magazine, summer of 2006, that has a little thing like, Winnefeld was flying. And I had a little blurb in there from me about how important it was, because it allowed me as the strike group commander to experience things that I could fix, that I probably wouldn't ordinarily have heard about. And in fact, that happened. My first sortie over Iraq, I get a call from a JTAC that says, "Are you rover equipped?" And I went, "I don't know, what's rover?" And as you know, it's a system where you can send the video from your FLIR down to the JTAC on the ground, and he can see what you're seeing. It's hugely important. And we didn't have that. And in fact, NavAir Syscom told us we couldn't get it on our Hornets, but because this was the last deployment of the F-14, they came out, and within 3 or 4 weeks, we had rover on all our Tomcats. It was a huge difference. And it actually caused us to fly mixed section of F-14 and F-18 because we had that enormous capability with us. And it would not have happened if I had not been flying over Iraq. So I get this call when this magazine article comes out, says, so-and-so is pissed. You were flying over Iraq as a strike group commander? And I went, well, yeah, I asked, Pat Walsh gave me permission, and it was all greased, and it really made a big difference. Yeah, but you could have gotten shot down. I'm going, like, who was going to shoot me down? Or you could have had a mishap and jumped out of an airplane, and you could have been captured. And I said, well, the Army guys don't keep their generals behind the barbed wire, so forget that. And for a while, I thought it was, yet another one of those moments in my career. It was like, well, it was a good career, but I guess that's it. And I think it was Mike Mullen, the CNO at the time, who said, knock it off. It was the right thing to do. Leave him alone.
And we have a cool picture of you manning up, 2 stars on your flight suit, climbing up the ladder of a Tomcat. That in terms of referent leadership, I don't think that it gets any better than that. And
especially since you don't have to do night traps.
Well, okay, there's that part. But, when a lieutenant is looking at that, like, why would I stay in? Because everybody's like, it doesn't look like anybody above the rank of 06 is having fun anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And so, not to mention the learnings, you're a guy who's always been hands-on, and I get it that you told me that, but I'd like to see it for myself. And I love the barbed wire analogy too, in terms of how the Army approaches flag officers, general officers in combat.
I definitely was not doing it for joyriding or anything like that. There was purpose behind it. And you have, as a senior leader flying, you have to be very careful not to abuse that, because, JO's got to get their flight time. You want to get them 100 traps on cruise, that whole thing. But it made a big difference. And it was interesting for me as an older guy to go out there on these 7-hour sorties. The first time I did it, 3 air-to-air refuelings off Air Force tankers, and that, sort of intense environment. I was exhausted when I landed. And then you sort of get used to it. And it sort of became a routine. And I think, flying twice a week.
To that point too, I think sometimes, at that level, 1-star, 2-star, what the squadron is doing can turn into an abstract or just an agenda item at a meeting, and so that you're, mindful of it through having done it is important in terms of op tempo, in terms of surge capability, in terms of all those things.
I did the same thing on Enterprise. And what that really revealed to me was, I knew this already, but how terribly slippery our flight deck had gotten after 6.5 months of deployment. And it kind of caused me to redouble my efforts with our team to try to find ways of kind of fixing that, getting fresh non-skid on there if we could.
It's one thing to walk around the flight deck and go, man, this looks slippery. And another thing to boot the nose gear and do one of these, like, damn, this is slippery. We got to fix this.
Yeah. Yeah, when you hit the brakes and you slide 3 feet, that's not good.
Exactly, right?
Yeah,
Right.
and there's an old guy named Baltasar Gracian who had a saying that the truth is rarely heard, usually seen. And I absolutely agree with you, Ward, that I think it's important that our senior aviation leadership actually has the opportunity to fly, because there's so much you draw from that. How's the airplane doing? How's the maintenance doing? How's the infrastructure doing? How are the people doing? Both air crews and our wonderful folks maintaining these airplanes. You have to experience it and breathe it in to be able to make a difference. And just as you pointed out, just sitting in a room and getting a PowerPoint brief absolutely is not adequate.
So what 3-star job did you do?
Oh, let's see. I went back. I was at GIFCOM for a while. That was probably my least favorite job I ever had in my whole life. But we don't need to get into that. And then I was blessed to be tapped to go to 6th Fleet, where I was relieved boomer Stufflebeam. And that was more than just 6th Fleet. It was also the commander of a NATO joint command in Lisbon. So I had a headquarters in Lisbon, and I had 2 headquarters in Naples. One was 6th Fleet, and the other was something called Striking and Support Forces, NATO. So, I mean, if you really want to add them up, I had 5 hats during that job. And it was only 1 year. I got moved out of there after a year, but it was a very intense year, because it was the year where 6th Fleet was the commander of EUCOM's Joint Task Force. So I had to do a certification exercise for that particular mission. And it was also the year that Joint Command Lisbon was the commander of the NATO Response Force, which you may have heard was very recently activated because of the Ukraine crisis with Russia. And I had to do a certification exercise for that job as well. So 2 major certification exercises, both of which we ran off of USS Mount Whitney. So it was a year, but it was a very busy year.
Was the family with you? Did you guys live in Gaeta, or where were you living?
We lived in Lisbon, Portugal, right outside Lisbon, Portugal, in a little fishing town called Cascais, which was a lot of fun, but I felt kind of isolated out there. And I did a lot of flying back and forth, and started off flying in a little C-123 or whatever, C-23, little prop plane. It was just totally inadequate for that. And I was very fortunate that the EUCOM commander finally gave me permission to use a C-9 to go back and forth, so I could move along between all those jobs fairly easily.
So ultimately, you wind up being the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Talk to us about that job, and what were some of the highlights of your tenure in that billet?
Sure. The intermediate jobs were as the Director of Strategic Plans and Policy for Admiral Mullen as the J5 on the Joint Staff. And then I went to be the commander of Northern Command and NORAD out in Colorado Springs. That was my first 4-star job. And then I thought I was going to be retiring from Colorado Springs after yet another 1 year on a job. I got tapped to go be the vice chairman to relieve Haas Cartwright, and spent 4 years doing that. And what a very fascinating front row seat. Essentially 3 kind of pillars in that job. One being the sort of policy pillar, 1,000 meetings in the White House sit room, briefing the president and the National Security Council whenever we needed to do a special operation to rescue a hostage or capture a terrorist or something like that outside of an area of combat, and a host of other topics in between you can imagine. The next sort of pillar being the sort of acquisition, requirements, acquisition, budgeting pillar, with a very close partnership with the Deputy Secretary of Defense, first Ash Carter and then Bob Work. And then the third pillar, kind of the people pillar, grooming, who's going to be the next joint leaders, who are going to be the senior flag and general officers across the military. How do we train these folks? How do we select them? How do we put them in the right jobs? So, I had to be fairly deep in all 3 of those pillars, but in each pillar, the people I was working with were only in that pillar. So they were, totally immersed in that, where I had to be sort of stretched across all 3. So it required some incredible, great staff people working for me. And, it was nonstop.
How much interface did you have with lawmakers? Were you having to testify? Were there folks in your office all the time asking how the wars were going or whatever? What was that part?
Yeah, a decent amount of interaction with Congress. First of all, I had to do 2 confirmation hearings, because at the time, the chairman and the vice chairman were the only jobs in the government where you had to get, it was only a 2-year job and you had to get reconfirmed if you were going to stay another 2. So that first confirmation hearing is easy. You can say, I look forward to working with the committee, and that's a really good question, Senator, and I'll get back to you on that. After you've been in the job 2 years and they want to beat up the president using you as their anvil, it's a little harder of a confirmation hearing. So got to do that, and then a host of other testimony in front of both the House and the Senate on a variety of issues. And then, some advocacy. I tried to be judicious about going to the Hill to advocate for things. The services do a lot of that. But when necessary, of course, I had to make a few important points with those folks. But it wasn't the favorite part of the job. I came away, with a few exceptions, with a fairly jaundiced view of our whole political culture. We have a wonderful Constitution. We've got a free nation. Sometimes the people manning up that polity are more in it for themselves than they are for our country, which is a disappointment to people like you and me who have served our country our whole lives.
Is this a critical failure, or is this something we got to work through? Where are we with respect to that dynamic?
Again, violently apolitical here. I'm an equal opportunity critic of both sides. Something has got to happen that causes more accountability for decision-making and responsible behavior on the part of our political class. I don't know whether it's going to require a crisis for that to happen, or whether it will happen naturally when the electorate just gets tired of it and starts voting other people in. But we have a system that's pretty broken. It's held hostage to very few individuals with probably an inordinate amount of power who can hold things up. And you can just see it in the amount of gridlock that we have in trying to get things done that are important for our country.
So when did you retire? What year did you retire?
I retired in 2015, July 31st of 2015. Had an amazing, fun ceremony and walked out the door.
And so I was told there would be no math on my channel. How many years was that end to end?
From start to finish?
Yep.
37 plus.
37 plus.
Yeah.
So what's happening now? I know you're working on some very cool, unorthodox things. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so a good bit of my time is spent, frankly, on corporate boards. I'm on the board of Molson Coors and Raytheon and Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I was delighted that the people I have the opportunity to work with in those areas are as good as the people I work with in the military, which I was nervous about, but they're just wonderful people. Do a little bit of support for a terrific merchant bank in Chicago and a number of startups. But there are a couple of other things that I'm doing that are very important to me. One is, as many of your listeners know, we lost our son on his 4th day of college to an accidental overdose of fentanyl-laced heroin. So my wife and Mary and I have started a nonprofit we call SAFE, which stands for Stop the Addiction Fatality Epidemic, SAFE Project, where we're trying to do everything we can to prevent other families from going through this terrible tragedy that we went through. And we now have around 18 employees, and we're a national organization trying to make a difference in that space. Another thing I have going is a fun podcast that I've started that our first episode should be up any week now. I was driving to Colorado, where we have a house, over Christmas last year, and was listening to podcasts. And unlike this wonderful production that you have, Ward, many of them are more about the host than they are about the guest, and the data rate's too slow. So I figured, hey, I can do better than that. I want to do a podcast about risk, people who take risk, and I want to have a partner who is a woman. And so I was very, very fortunate in being able to convince a retired astronaut named Sandra Magnus, who's a remarkable individual, been into space 3 times, be my co-host. And so we've started that. We've had some really great guests, and the name of that podcast, when it's online here shortly, will be The Adrenaline Zone. And that's been a lot of fun. And then finally, I've also in the end game of putting together a memoir, a book that will be entitled Sailing Upwind, which is, when you think about what a sailboat does when it's sailing upwind, is it's managing itself to fight against a prevailing force field, which is kind of what I did my whole career, and fighting against bureaucracy and trying to lead some kind of change in a positive direction, which was sort of the real, other than the people I got to work with, was the real joy of being a naval officer for 37 years.
So that book is going to be published by the Naval Institute Press. So you
Right.
and I will be stablemates
That's right.
there, which is fantastic.
Although I've got a long way to go to catch up to your formidable track record.
Oh, well, this courtesy of this YouTube channel. So Admiral, proud to have known you all these years. I thank you for the honor of telling us your story here on the channel. I will put the links to the SAFE project and your podcast in the episode description. So everybody, please check that out. And I hope our paths cross again soon.
It's been a pleasure, Ward, and best wishes to you on this terrific project you've got.
Thank you, sir. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you're a first-time viewer, please ring the bell and become a subscriber so you don't miss anything. Give me the likes and comment. Check the links below for merch, including Where to Get the Punks trilogy. My first 3 books about life in an F-14 squad are now available as a Kindle, so go to Amazon.com and check that out. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again soon.